Hi, welcome to the first week video tutorial. Basically what follows is a short presentation where I'm going to walk you through some of the most salient or important points from the first three chapters of the course text you're assigned reading for this week. And then I'm going to go over an example. We're going to look at the actual assignment itself together, and I want to show you um, the rubric that I will use to grade your week one major assignment, which is the professional memo. So we begin with some pointers and basically some information to acclimate you to this style of writing. So as you may have noticed, hopefully in your reading, or if you haven't gotten to the reading yet, you can certainly use this presentation to sort of walk you through, make sure certainly that you understand the points that I highlight in this presentation. But basically, one of the things I want to emphasize as we kick off the course here is how different professional writing is from other styles of writing. So to me, one of the things that sets professional writing apart from other styles of writing that you may be more familiar with, like the academic writing you did during your first year writing course, or maybe creative writing, is that you can never assume in a professional setting that you have a captive audience. So in other words, your writing has to get the reader's attention and keep the reader's attention until you get your point across. So some of the best ways we can do this are to shoot for short, clear, and correct writing. So one of the things I want to note too is how significant and important these skills are going to continue to be in the professional world. As our world becomes increasingly web-based, and who we are to the people around us becomes increasingly sort of a text-based thing. Most of who we are to our colleagues and to our peers in professional settings involves text, email, and those types of venues rather than the more traditional face-to-face conversations. So these are skills that cannot be outsourced, and more professional workplaces are looking for incredibly skilled communicators. So we're after sort of acclimating you to this style of writing and getting you pretty well versed as a professional communicator this summer. So again, some of the things that are prioritized in this style of writing are clarity. Is your message clear and well organized? Are you only really telling the reader what they need to know in a specific situation? So highlighting the most significant and important issues, and leaving all the other stuff out, because chances are good that the reader doesn't care. And if you go into a lot of detail about things that the reader doesn't care about or that don't seem relevant to them, you're going to lose that audience. Um, Concision. So that's the next thing we want to work for. This is not a style of writing where we want to try to say things with big fancy words or try to say them in long, flourishy sentences. Instead, we want concise messages conveyed in as few words as possible. And then the other big one, of course, is correctness. So this carries over probably from your first year in academic writing experiences and from your other writing experiences prior to your first year course. Uh, One of the things we're always shooting for is a grammatically correct and error-free message. One of the quickest ways to lose an audience is to produce a piece of writing that's riddled with errors. So those are the things that set professional writing apart from maybe some of the other styles of writing you may be more familiar with. Successful professional writing, more specifically, includes two things: attention to a particular goal and attention to a particular audience. So one of the things we're working on most heavily during this first week is audience awareness. You're constantly imagining your audience and keeping in mind their priorities and sort of their interests as you write for them. And the other thing we're going to keep working on all summer is attention to a particular goal. So you're working to either inform your audience of something, so explain a complex piece of information. Again, we don't want to use big fancy words here. We want to use layman's terms and make sure our message is clear. But we want to make sure we've got a clear information if we're writing an informative memo or an informative business report. Another goal might be to persuade. We might want to convince our audience of something, maybe that they need our service or our product, um, or to problem solve. So often you're identifying a problem in a piece of professional writing and then comparing two or more solutions and proposing a resolution to that problem. That's what we'll be working towards as we work towards the business report that you'll produce as collaborative groups towards the end of the summer. And again, attention to a particular audience is hugely important throughout this class. You're always keeping your audience in mind, and you're always writing for that audience. You're working to build goodwill with that audience and highlight any benefits for them that you're presenting as you persuade them or problem solve or inform them of a particular issue. Okay, so this brings us to the readings themselves. I asked you for this week to read the first 3 chapters in our course text. And the first chapter is called Succeeding in Business Communication. So this chapter is sort of an orientation chapter and sort of reiterates some of the main points here that we want to be attentive to are the basic criteria for professional and effective professional communication, which are outlined on page 12. So again, we're shooting for clear, complete, correct messages. We want our messages to save the audience time and to build goodwill. That means we want to make sure we're being, again, respectful of the audience's time. We're thanking the audience for their time, and we're making sure that we're polite and not wasting their time by producing messages that are, again, riddled with error or grammatically incorrect or that type of thing. So one of the most important parts in this first chapter are the questions for analysis on page 15. Asking yourself these questions before beginning any assignment in this course should increase your success as a professional writer. So you want to keep these questions sort of on hand as you work through the course, and anytime I ask you to produce an assignment, you want to try to think about these things. So first you're asking yourself, who's your audience? Second, what is your purpose in communicating? And again, here you want to create a list. What is the main objective you have? What's your professional goal as you produce this piece of writing? Then you're thinking about what things your message must include. Again, I recommend you make a list and you figure out which points you want to emphasize and which points you maybe want to de-emphasize. To de-emphasize points, you put them in the middle of the document and address them as briefly as possible. To emphasize points, you put them up front or at the end, or maybe in both places if you're really wanting to get a particular aspect of your message highlighted. Then you're asking yourself how you can build support for your position, and you're outlining benefits that are adapted to your particular audience. And then you're thinking about which aspects of the situation are relevant, making sure to exclude any aspects that are irrelevant from the communication itself. You're also thinking about these big criteria that we're going to work on throughout the course. You're thinking about organization, creating visual appeal, and then you're thinking about the steps that always go along with any good piece of writing, regardless of the style you're working in. You want to make sure you allow yourself plenty of time to revise and edit. Hopefully you recall from your first year writing course, there's a difference between these 2 steps. Revision really involves content, the ideas in the document. And you're thinking about whether you can build goodwill and establish clients' confidence in your work by creating a friendly, business-like, positive tone and style in your document. That all occurs typically in revision. And then editing, you're thinking about errors. You want to make sure you're double checking grammar, sentence structure, names, numbers, and facts. It's particularly important in professional writing to produce error-free documentation. There's no quicker way to lose a client's confidence than to produce a document that's full of typos and things of that nature. And then, of course, in the end, you want to use your response, what you learn about your audience, the response you receive from them, to adapt and plan future messages. So we're thinking about these things throughout anytime we produce a professional document throughout this course as well. Okay, so this brings us to chapter 2, where we talk more specifically about adapting a message to an audience. One of the most important things from that chapter that the authors tell us right up front is that there are these particular types of audiences. So you want to make sure you review page 28 if this information doesn't look familiar to you. But typically you have these 5 types of audiences. The gatekeeper, who controls whether the message actually gets to the primary audience. This could be somebody like a secretary, or somebody in the mailroom, or even a boss who's not sure whether he's going to show his employees a particular message. Then the primary audience, though, that's the audience you're actually typically writing for often, and this is the audience that you want to act on the basis of your message. A secondary audience could be asked to read the message, review it, comment on it, maybe implement your ideas. So maybe the primary audience is in fact the boss or the supervisor, and he or she may ask the audience to the secondary audience, maybe his employer or employees, and he or she may be asking that audience to actually implement whatever action you've recommended in your professional correspondence. Fourthly, we have the auxiliary audience. Those are people that might read the message but aren't really impacted by it. So they're sort of a peripheral audience. And lastly, we have a watchdog audience. So these could be people like attorneys, politicians, people with social or economic power. They're not going to act directly on the message, but further action down the road may be based on an evaluation of your message. So in this case, for example, when I did work for the Arizona Attorney General's office, one of the things that we were constantly aware of is that any documentation you produced was put into a file that's sort of a permanent file kept forever, and future action down the road, months from now, years from now, the attorneys may decide to take action based on the documentation we were producing. So in that case, the attorneys might be considered the watchdog audience. It's important to note that one person can be part of two of these audiences. So we're thinking about really dissecting who the audience is anytime we produce a piece of professional documentation. To analyze our audience, to think about these things, once we've sort of figured out who our primary audience is, we want to consider whether the audience is an individual or a group, and then we're thinking about things like demographics and psychographic characteristics. So demographics are measurable features, sort of things based on fact or research, things like age, sex, race, religion, education, level of income. So those are all demographic characteristics. Psychographic characteristics, conversely, are information like the audience's values, beliefs, goals, lifestyle. So more maybe internal things. So we want to think about those, sort of the makeup of our audience, what we know about them. This may involve doing research. If we know our audience is sort of an organization, a group, a company, we're going to do research. We're going to get on that company's website, look at their mission statement, look at the about page, and learn as much about that company as we can. This is involved in considering the organization's culture, the attitudes, values, and philosophies of the organization itself. The company often has these things reflected in their mission statement. We also want to think about the type of discourse community. We're trying to get a clear message across. Often companies have shared assumptions about the way messages should come to them, the formats, the channels, and the styles used for communication. So you want to think about those things as well. So for example, if we're going to submit a proposal to a company and they have a specific form that they expect consultants to use, we want to make sure we run through those specific channels and present our information in the style that the company is used to. So again, often this involves researching the audience, particularly if we have a group audience, such as a company or organization. Okay, so we also want to think about our audience's initial reaction. Often, as I said, in professional writing, you can never assume you have a captive audience. So you want to assume that you've got this one chance to sort of grab your reader's attention. So often this is done, pardon me, in the subject line or the first line of a piece of correspondence or a professional document. So if you're writing a professional email, a professional memo, a professional letter, you want to make sure you use the subject line or the regarding line to announce what's going on in the piece of correspondence. So you don't waste this opportunity to capture your reader's attention. So you want to make sure you let them know that the message is important and clarify what the message is about right off the bat. You also want to make the actions or requests you're discussing in your piece of correspondence as easy as possible. You want to provide realistic deadlines and keep the message short. This is the best way to sort of capture your audience's attention and keep it. You also want to think about creating positive reactions from your audience. So again, we're trying to think about who our audience might be. We've done a little research. We've tried to find out as much as we can about, the culture and values of the individual or organization. And so we want to make sure we're thinking from our audience's point of view in this way, and we're only including information in our document that our audience needs. We want to emphasize things with areas where we might agree with our audience, the common ground that we have. Again, we want to make our requests easy. We want to put good news first and highlight benefits for the audience. We want to think about expectations regarding language, content, and organization, and imagine how the audience will ultimately use the document. Chapter 3 really talked quite a bit about building goodwill with an audience, and the two main things I want to emphasize from Chapter 3 involve you attitude and creating positive emphasis. So you attitude is sort of, we're thinking about perspective a little bit, and in our academic writing courses and in other courses where we've been told never to use second person you. In professional writing, we actually want to try to use you because we're talking to this audience, and we want to make it clear that the piece of correspondence, the professional communication we've created, is about the audience, not necessarily about us. A professional audience typically doesn't want to read all kinds of stuff about somebody else. They're more interested in the benefits to them. So you want to use you attitude, talk about the audience, not yourself. Refer specifically to the customer's request, so showing them that you're being attentive to them and their needs. Throughout any piece of professional writing, and really in the professional sphere in general, you want to avoid talking about feelings. So you want to avoid that pitfall if you can. Use you more often than I. Keep in mind that it is okay to use we, but only when whatever you're talking about includes both you and the audience. If it's a negative situation you're presenting, avoid use of the word you. You're thinking about protecting your audience's ego, and you want to avoid, of course, assigning blame or making it seem like you're pointing the finger at the audience in some way. Then you want to think about positive emphasis. So you want to avoid negative words or words with negative connotations. Hidden negatives are another thing to avoid. That sounds sort of gray, but words like hope, I hope I'm doing what you need to, involve hidden negatives because the hope suggests that maybe you haven't quite accomplished what the audience had in mind. So check out page 65 of the course text if you're confused about hidden negatives, because there are some great examples there. Again, we want to focus on things the audience can do instead of the negatives. So again, you're keeping professional correspondence always positive is your best bet. If you do have negative information, justify it and link the negative to a potential audience benefit. So you want to try to flip things around and spin them as positively as you can whenever you're producing a professional document. Again, you can de-emphasize negative information by putting it in the middle of the document and presenting it compactly. So you want it to be sort of a brief little snippet, and then you move on to something positive or a way that you can turn the negative into a positive. One pitfall to avoid is insincerity. If you're overly positive, that might cause your reader to lose faith in you. So you want to make sure the positivity doesn't cloud the reality. You can't spin the letter to make it seem like there's a potential benefit out there that does not in fact exist. So you want to keep that in mind. You want to be positive, but you still have to stay within the realm of realistic expectation. Okay, so important terms to sort of keep in mind from our readings this week. You can review these on your own, but these include conventions, widely accepted practices, routinely encountered in business. So again, this is involved in audience expectation. Typically, you want to avoid jargon. And this is language used by a particular group or people for a particular activity. So this we run into in business quite a bit. So for example, if I'm an environmental consultant, the environmental field is riddled with sort of acronyms that everybody within the field knows pretty well. It's almost like a second language. UST stands for Underground Storage Tank. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is abbreviated RCRA, and everybody talks about RCRA. But if I'm writing a document for somebody outside the environmental consulting field and I include all of these acronyms in my document, people are going to be very put off and confused because they're going to think I'm talking down to them, that I somehow think I'm smarter than them because I know all this lingo. So again, you want to keep your audience in mind. Maybe if you're writing for somebody inside your field that's going to know your jargon, that might be appropriate. But typically, you're writing for people outside of your field who are not familiar and comfortable with your jargon, and you want to avoid using jargon entirely. So keep that in mind. You want to make sure you're basically writing for a layman, somebody that's not an expert in your area. Most of the time, that's what we're shooting for in professional writing. So again, we want to avoid big words that might confuse our audience. We want to make sure our writing is clear and understandable by almost anyone. We talked about you attitude. We talked about highlighting audience benefits. So again, you want to review these things. They're very significant and important from our first reading this week. We talked about tone. Tone is the implied attitude of the communicator toward the audience. We want to keep this in mind always. So again, we're imagining who our audience might be. If it's an audience we know well and we've worked with quite a bit, we might be able to say, "Dear Tony or Rick," or whoever they are, call them by their first name. But typically, when you're producing a professional document, you want to be formal and respectful and sort of distance yourself, create this professional tone. So if it's an audience that we don't know well, obviously we don't want to start out saying "Dear Rick." We want to say "Dear Dr. Smith" or "Dear Mrs. So-and-so." We want to make sure we set the tone right off the bat, that we create formal, respectful sort of distance in our professional communication. So again, audience analysis, hugely important in creating the right tone. And we also want to think about bias-free language, which is something that's highlighted in these chapters. So making sure that our language does not discriminate against people in any way, shape, or form. So revisit page 71 of the course text if you're unclear on what bias-free language is. Okay, so this brings us to the assignment itself. So this is an example from the course text, in fact, of a sort of poorly structured professional letter. So one of the things, this week we're actually producing a professional memo, and next week we'll produce our first professional letter. The difference between the two is really that a memo typically assumes your audience is internal. You're writing for somebody within your company or organization, whereas a letter is external. You're writing for a customer, a client, an audience outside of your organization. So I thought it might be worth visiting this or reviewing this letter together just for some examples of why this might be poorly done. So again, we want to think about immediately grabbing our audience's attention when we're thinking about who our audience might be. One of the best ways we're thinking about grabbing our audience's attention is through the subject line in the letter. So again, any professional email or piece of correspondence you produce, you want to make sure you're taking advantage of that subject line to grab the audience's attention. So oftentimes in the professional world these days, things are not going out into the world via regular mail anymore. So a letter like this, when I was working as a consultant anyway, typically what I do is I would produce a letter like this, create a PDF, and then attach this to an email. And so the letter's format is not obsolete by any stretch of the imagination. Typically in the professional world, we still produce letters like this, and then we send them out into the world via email attachment. So in this case, we want to think about our subject line here. The example says, "The following information is time sensitive. Please review carefully." But we haven't given the reader a sense at all of what this letter is going to be about. So one of the things the subject line should definitely do is give our reader a sense of what our letter would in fact be about. So you can see this letter really needs some dramatic reorganization. First of all, we're putting a demand on our reader almost immediately. This information is time sensitive. In other words, you have a deadline in dealing with this, and that's typically not the best way to capture our reader's attention. And then this "please review carefully" is a bit vague. So there might be a better subject line down here. So in some ways, this author's instinct was good because we've got at least the purpose of the letter happening in the first paragraph, but it doesn't happen until sort of the end of the first paragraph. Typically, you want that information to appear up front and capture your reader's attention almost immediately. So maybe these ideas might be better off becoming part of the subject line. Your 2009 Honda Civic has been classified as a high demand vehicle. The purpose of this letter is to request the opportunity to buy back your vehicle for perhaps more than you thought possible. So if I'm this author, I'm going to condense this information into the subject line and then re-emphasize it in the opening line. Your 2009 Honda Civic is in high demand, and we want to request the opportunity to buy back your vehicle for more than you thought possible. We want to condense all of this down and put it in the subject line. We probably want to lose these first lines here because we're missing the you attitude. This is all about James Honda of Lincoln, and if I'm this reader, I'm thinking, why do I care that James Honda is partnered with automobile real sellers? I'm going to probably discard this letter pretty quickly because it begins with sort of a history of what's happening at James Honda. I'm a customer. I don't care about that. What I care about is that I might get money for my Honda more than it's even worth. If you keep reading, you notice that there's some other really significant and important information embedded in this letter. So for example, it says in this second line here, bring this letter for admittance to this event, simply present it to the dealership representative who will assist you in the buyback process. Also, you may have won up to $20,000. So again, this is information that this author might have presented much earlier in the letter, potentially in the subject line or at the very least in the opening paragraph to grab the reader's attention. Here's the benefit to you. So we want to make sure we're using you attitude and emphasizing the benefits to the audience. Currently, this letter is not doing this. The other things happening here include a lot of instructions for the audience. And so this author might have thought about using bullet points to sort of organize what this audience might need to do once they receive this letter if they actually decide to pursue this opportunity. So this author needed to really rethink who their audience might be, how they might grab their attention, the information the audience in fact needs. Because in fact, does our audience need to know that James Honda has partnered with automobile real sellers or that their vehicle inventory is reduced? Probably not. So we need to revise, condense, and think about organization in this letter. These things may be helpful to you as you think about memo production for major assignment 1 during this first week of the course. So this is our next slide. Here is your assignment itself. So basically, I'm asking you to imagine yourself in the professional world already. And you can invent a scenario if you want, or you can think about a scenario you've already encountered in your workplace. You're going to imagine you're writing a memo to a woman named Jane Cannon, who's the newly appointed head of your company. You can make up your own company name as you do this. So your immediate supervisor has asked you to contact Jane Cannon, the head of the company, about a problem at your plant or store which you are directly aware of and for which you have a proposed solution. You are free to use a real situation from your current job, like I said, or from a previous job experience. You want to imagine a specific setting here so you can imagine who your audience is and create this memo effectively. You want to assume that Jane Cannon is newly moved to this position of leadership, so she doesn't know anything about the situation that you're addressing. So you've got to provide background on the situation and make sure you give her the information necessary for her to understand the situation you're trying to correct. So basically your goal here is to persuade your audience, right? So you're going to present her with a problem and propose a solution. You want to try to persuade the audience that your solution is correct. When you're doing this assignment, remember that the audience to whom you're writing is very specifically this Jane Cannon woman who's new to this position and isn't familiar with your situation. So you're the credible source because you're the one that does this job day to day. You want to think about the strategies we've been talking about during this presentation and that you read about in the first 3 chapters of the course text. So you want to think about you attitude, positive emphasis, non-biased language. You also need to establish credibility for yourself as a writer. So if you look carefully at the letter, or at the assignment, credibility is already built in there. Be very careful to use the appropriate tone and formality when addressing an executive, and make the memo as clear and easy to read as you possibly can. Experiment with things like headers, bullet points, and don't forget to tell Jane Cannon what you would like her to do about the situation as you conclude the letter. Um, Make sure you choose a situation for your memo that you deem appropriate and that is serious enough to bring to an executive's attention. So, for example, if somebody's forgetting to water the plants on the weekend, likely not something that the executive needs to know about. That's something you can resolve on your own. So, you want to think about a situation that would merit the head of the company's attention. It's got to be a problem big enough for that. Um, your memo should be at least 2/3 of the page, not counting the heading. So keep that in mind and think about the organization I have laid out for you here. As a second option, you could do a more complex assignment and receive a few points of extra credit, 5 points exactly. And this would involve finding a video clip or a block of text, something that outlines a scenario for you. So you could find a short scene from a TV show, a movie, a book, a newspaper, and find that involves a problem related to your career field. Detail the scene and provide a recommendation to your supervisor, who also in this case is known as Jane Cannon. So if you're interested in this option, you may want to read this a bit more carefully. The memo assignment itself is due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, July 10th, and you have an optional revision, which is due at 11:59 p.m. on July 17th. So basically what will happen is the first draft is you'll submit your final memo to me on July 10th. If you really aren't happy with your grade, you'll have an opportunity to revise once I give you some feedback, and you can resubmit on July 17th. This will give us a little bit of time to acclimate to this style of writing and give you the opportunity to rethink some of the things you might have done differently if it doesn't go so well during the first week. Okay, so a couple other notes, and then I'm going to sign off here. Here is an example memo. So I do, in fact, want you to create a letterhead and make it look professional. So we're thinking about presentation, and then basically this is just an example of the way you might consider laying it out. And lastly, I provided for you the rubric that I will use to grade Major Assignment 1. So this way you know exactly what you're shooting for. You're thinking about whether content and clarity, whether the document is oriented towards your specific audience, whether you've established credibility, whether you have a good subject line, a concise statement of purpose. So make sure you review the rubric, as it may be helpful as you're thinking about formatting and putting together Major Assignment 1, this memorandum. But again, the main things we're looking at are content and clarity, organization and layout, and style, tone, and mechanics. Once again, if you have any questions at any point during this week as you're working on this assignment, feel free to email me. My email's on the syllabus, which is on the homepage right now for our Canvas site. You can always call me, and you're welcome at any time to email me and come up with a time we could meet in my office and sit down together. I'm more than happy to sit down face to face. Hopefully this helps. Good luck in week 1, and again, please email me with any problems, questions, or concerns.